Richard thought he had pulled off the perfect divorce. He kept the sprawling estate, the offshore accounts, and left his wife with mere pennies. He was practically popping the champagne cork in his mind. Then the heavy oak courtroom doors swung open, and a ghost from the past walked in. The air inside Cook County Circuit Courtroom 4002 was stifling, thick with the scent of lemon, polish, old paper, and the unspoken tension of ruined lives. Rain-battered, the high-arched windows casting long, weeping shadows across the mahogany benches that Richard Dalton didn't notice the gloom. In fact, it was the brightest day of his life. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, adjusting the cuffs of his $4,000 bespoke buy-in suit, his gold Rolex gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was 42, impeccably groomed with silver dusting. His temples, a man who had conquered the logistics industry and was now finally conquering his marriage. He exuded the relaxed confidence of a predator that had already broken the neck of its prey. Across the aisle, sitting at the respondent's table, was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Clara. Clara Hayes Dalton looked like a faded photograph of the woman he had married a decade ago. She wore a simple muted navy dress that hung loosely on her frame. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed firmly on the scuffed wooden floorboards. She looked utterly defeated. Beside her sat Sarah Jenkins, a public defender turned family lawyer who looked equally exhausted, her desk cluttered with disorganized manila folders and a half-empty cup of cold coffee. "Your Honor," boomed Gregory Finch, Richard's high-powered attorney. Finch was a bulldog of a man in a sharkin suit, known for vicious cross-examinations and a complete lack of empathy. "The financial disclosures are clear, comprehensive, and uncontested. My client, Mr. Dalton, built Dalton Logistics from the ground up through his own sheer will and business acumen. The prenuptial agreement signed willingly by Miss Hayes 10 years ago clearly delineates the separation of premarital business assets from marital property." Finch paced confidently in front of the judge's bench. Furthermore, the defense has failed to produce a single shred of evidence proving that Miss Hayes contributed financially or strategically to the growth of the company. Therefore, the proposed settlement of lump sum of $50,000, the retention of her personal vehicle, and 3 years of spousal support, capped at $5,000 a month, is not only legally sound, but extraordinarily generous given the circumstances. Richard allowed a micro smirk to ghost across his lips. Generous. It was an insult, and he loved it. Dalton Logistics was recently valued at $85 million. But Richard, a master of corporate shell games, had spent the last 3 years systematically bleeding the company's liquid assets into a labyrinth of offshore trusts, the crown jewel being a Caymans-based holding company he cleverly named Blue Horizon. On paper, Richard Dalton was heavily leveraged, cash poor, and struggling to keep his business afloat in a post-pandemic economy. In reality, he was set up to live like an emperor the moment the ink dried on the divorce decree. Judge Thomas Harrison, a stern, white-haired jurist who looked like he had seen every ugly facet of human nature, peered over his reading glasses at Clara. "Miss Jenkins," Judge Harrison said, his voice growly, "I have reviewed your filings regarding the alleged hidden assets. However, allegations are not proof. You've presented no paper trail connecting Mr. Dalton to these offshore accounts, nor have you successfully challenged the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Does the defense have anything substantive to add before I rule on the asset division?" Richard leaned over to Finch, whispering behind a manicured hand. "We got her. She has nothing." Finch gave a brief tight nod. "It's over, Richard. Try to look Little sad when he brings the hammer down. Richard looked at Clara again. He almost felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly swallowed by a wave of intoxicating triumph. He had spent years isolating Clara, convincing her she was incompetent, managing every cent that came into the house. He had cut her off from her friends, intercepted her mail, and systematically dismantled her self-esteem. The masterstroke, however, was her family. Clara came from a fractured background. Her mother had passed away when she was young, and her father, Arthur Pendleton, was a notoriously difficult man and eccentric expatriate who had supposedly blown his fortune on failed ventures in Europe. 7 years ago, Richard had intercepted a letter from Arthur asking to reconnect with Clara. Richard had burned it, telling Clara later that he had spoken to her father's associates in London and learned the old man had died penniless in a public hospital. Clara had mourned, and in her grief she had become entirely dependent on Richard. It was the perfect psychological cage. "Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins said, her voice shaking slightly as she stood up. "The defense acknowledges the strict terms of the prenuptial agreement. However," she paused, looking down at her notes, seeming to lose her nerve. Finch let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Your Honor, please. We have been litigating this for 8 months. My clients' businesses are suffering due to the ongoing stress of these proceedings. Miss Jenkins is stalling. I will allow Miss Jenkins to finish her sentence." "Mr. Finch," Judge Harrison snapped, silencing the aggressive lawyer. "Proceed, counselor." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jenkins said, taking a deep breath and standing a little taller. The nervous energy suddenly vanished from her posture, replaced by a strange, icy calm. "We are not contesting the parameters of the prenuptial agreement. We are contesting the entire foundational premise of Mr. Dalton's financial empire. We assert that Dalton Logistics is not and never was his property." Richard frowned. He glanced at Finch, who looked mildly annoyed but unconcerned. "That is a bold claim, Counselor Judge," Harrison noted, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. "A claim that requires extraordinary proof. According to the incorporation documents filed 10 years ago, Mr. Dalton provided the initial $2 million seed capital via a private loan." "Yes, Your Honor," Jenkins replied, stepping out from behind her desk. "A private loan from a blind trust, a trust Mr. Dalton planed under oath was administered by an independent holding group that was later dissolved," and the judge prompted. Jenkins turned slowly to look directly at Richard. For the first time in months, Clara raised her head. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, bright, and fixed on Richard with an intensity that sent a sudden, inexplicable chill down his spine. "And Your Honor," Jenkins continued, a voice ringing clearly through the cavernous courtroom, "we have acquired the original, unredacted charter for that blind trust. Furthermore, we have a witness who can testify to the true origin of that seed money, the conditions under which it was dispersed, and the direct route of the funds Mr. Per Dalton has illicitly funneled into the Cayman Islands over the last 36 months. Gregory Finch was on his feet in an instant, his face flushing dark red. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an ambush. Discovery closed 3 weeks ago. Miss Jenkins cannot introduce a surprise witness at the 11th hour of a final hearing. This is a blatant violation of procedure and a desperate attempt to derail a legitimate settlement. Your Honor." Jenkins counted smoothly. "We only secured this witness 48 hours ago. Under Rule 2013, an exception can be made if the evidence pertains to an active, ongoing fraud upon the court. Mr. Dalton has committed perjury regarding his financial disclosures. He swore under Both he had no knowledge of the blue horizon accounts. This witness can prove he is the sole signatory, and more importantly, that the original seed money for his business was conditional upon his marriage to my client. Richard felt the breath leave his lungs. Blue horizon. How did she know that name? He had paid top-tier fixes in Geneva and Georgetown to bury that name behind 6 layers of corporate anonymity. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trap bird. Judge Harrison stared at Jenkins, then shifted his hard gaze to Richard, who suddenly felt very exposed. In his expensive suit, the judge picked up his gavel, turning it slowly in his hands. Fraud upon the court is a severe allegation, Miss Jenkins, the judge warned, his tone deadly serious. If you are wasting the court's time, I will sanction you so heavily you'll be practicing law out of a cardboard box. I understand the risks perfectly, Your Honor, Jenkins replied without flinching. I strongly object to this. Circus, Finch roared. Overruled, Mr. Finch. Sit down, Judge Harrison barked. I am going to hear this. If the witness is irrelevant, I will strike the testimony and finalize the judgment. Today, call your witness, Miss Jenkins. Richard grabbed Finch's sleeve, his knuckles white. Stop her, Greg. Do something. He hissed, panic, finally, piercing his arrogant armor. Relax. Finch muttered back, violently yanking his arm away. It's a bluff. Probably some disgruntled former accountant looking for a payout. I'll tear them apart on cross-examination. Just keep your mouth shut and look calm. But Richard couldn't look calm. The walls of the courtroom suddenly felt like they were closing in. Sarah Jenkins turned toward the back of the courtroom. The defense calls Arthur Pendleton to the stand. The name hung in the air for a second, suspended in the heavy silence of the room. Richard froze. All the blood rushed from his head, leaving his face the color of old parchment. Arthur Pendleton. No, that was impossible. Arthur was dead. He had to be dead. Richard had lied to Clara about it. Yes, but he had genuinely believed the old man was rotting in an unmarked grave. In the UK, he looked at Clara. She was watching him, and the faint, ghostly smile playing on her lips was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The heavy brass-handled doors at the back of the courtroom clicked. Every head in the gallery turned slowly. The heavy oak doors swung outward. Standing in the threshold was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a different century, bringing a thunderstorm in with him. Arthur Pendleton was 76 years old, but he stood with the ramrod straight posture of a military general. He wore a flawless charcoal gray three-piece suit that practically hummed with wealth. In his right hand, he gripped a walking stick made of polished blackthorn tipped with heavy silver. His hair was a mane of thick, stark white, swept back from a face carved from granite. But it was his eyes that arrested the room, pale, piercing blue, sharp as broken glass, and fixed directly on Richard Dalton. The rhythmic thwack-tap of Arthur's cane against the wooden floor echoed like a death nail as he made his way down the center aisle. Richard couldn't breathe. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He tried to speak, to whisper to Finch, but his throat was completely dry. This wasn't the broke, eccentric failure he had imagined. This man radiated an aura of immense quiet and terrifying power. Finch, sensing his client's total mental collapse, looked at Richard. Who the hell is that? He whispered. Urgently. Her father, Richard choked out, his voice barely a rasp. Finch, eyes widened. I thought you told me her father was a dead, penniless drunk. He was supposed to be. Richard hissed in panic. Arthur reached the wooden gate, separating the gallery from the well of the court. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Clara. His rigid, intimidating expression softened for just a fraction of a second, a silent communication passing between father and daughter. Then the granite mask slipped back into place as he approached the witness. The babe stepped forward holding out a worn Bible. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do, Arthur said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, carrying a refined transatlantic accent that commanded absolute silence in the room. He took his seat in the witness box, resting his silver-tipped cane between his knees and settled his piercing blue eyes on Richard Dorton. State your name for the record, Jenkins said, approaching the podium. Arthur William Pendleton. Mr. Pendleton, can you please tell the court your current occupation? I am the senior managing partner and primary shareholder of Pendleton and Croft, a private equity and wealth management firm based in London and Zurich. Arthur replied evenly. Finch practically dropped his pen. Pendleton and Croft wasn't just a firm. It was an institution that managed billions in European aristocratic wealth. Richard felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He was a millionaire. But this man was a Leviathan. Mr. Pendleton, Jenkins continued, stepping closer to the witness box. Are you familiar with the plaintiff in this case, Richard Dalton? Arthur did not break eye contact with Richard intimately. Unfortunately, can you explain to the court the nature of your relationship with Mr. Dalton? 10 years ago, Arthur began, his voice echoing in the dead, silent courtroom. My daughter Clara informed me she intended to marry a mid-level manager at a shipping firm. I had reservations. I am a man of considerable means, and my daughter is my sole heir. To protect her and to test the mettle of the man she chose, I orchestrated a blind financial arrangement. Judge Harrison leaned over his desk entirely captivated. Continue, Mr. Pendleton. Nank through a proxy firm in New York, Arthur explained. I arranged for Mr. Dalton to receive a $2 million unsecured business loan to start his logistics company. The loan came with a very specific confidential covenant built into the blind trust charter. The funds and all subsequent equity generated from them were granted on the condition of his legal marriage to my daughter, should he file for divorce or be found guilty of financial malfeasance against her. The principal loan, adjusted for corporate growth and compound interest, would instantly revert back to the trust. Arthur paused, a cold, ruthless smile touching the corners of his mouth. In layman's terms, Your Honor, I own Dalton Logistics. Every truck, every warehouse, every single dime. Richard Dalton has never been a CEO. He has been my unwitting, temporary employee. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Order, order. In the court, Richard felt the room spinning. His $85 million empire, the offshore accounts, the decade of smug superiority. It was all a house of cards, built on a foundation owned by the man he thought he had erased from his wife's life. Objection! Finch screamed, his voice cracking as he stood up, realizing his career might go down with this sinking ship. This is ARC a veritale. Where is the proof of this absurd arrangement? Sarah. Jenkins calmly picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from her desk. Your Honor, I would like to submit defense Exhibit D into evidence. The original, unredacted charter of the proxy trust, signed by Mr. Dorton 10 years ago, containing the conditional covenant Mr. Balfan Pendleton just described. She handed copies to the bailiff, who passed one to the judge and one to Finch. Finch snatched the document, his eyes darting frantically over the pages. Richard leaned over, his vision blurring, but he could clearly see his own signature at the bottom of the page, right below a dense paragraph of legal text he had apparently never bothered to read properly 10 years ago. There's more. Your Honor, Jenkins said, a voice, dropping the final anvil. Mr. Pendleton's firm also specializes in forensic accounting. Over the last 2 weeks, his team has tracked the exact routing numbers Mr. Threshen Dolphin used to drain the company's liquid assets into the Cayman Islands. Jenkins looked at Richard, mirroring the cold triumph he had felt just 20 minutes prior. We have the wire transfers, the IP addresses, and the signatory documents. For Blue Horizon, Mr. Dalton hasn't just attempted to defraud my client. By hiding these assets, he has attempted to embezzle from Mr. Pendleton. Arthur leaned forward in the witness stand, his pale blue eyes pinning Richard to his chair like a butterfly on a corkboard. You see, Richard, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. You thought you broke my daughter's wings, but you forgot who gave them to her in the first place. Richard's chest tightened, a cold, prickly sweat instantly drenching his bespoke brownie shirt. The silence in the cavernous courtroom was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic heavy drumming of the rain against the tall glass windows. Finch, desperate to salvage his reputation, his lucrative hourly rate, and whatever percentage he was expecting from Richard's offshore stash, stepped forward. His face was a mask of furious manufacturer bravado. Mr. Pendleton, this is an impressive theatrical display, I'll admit, but courts of law deal in empirical facts, not bedtime stories. Even if this alleged trust document is real, which we vehemently contest, you expect this court to believe you simply handed $2 million to a man you didn't trust with no oversight. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked down at Finch with the mild, detached curiosity of a man observing an annoying buzzing insect on a hot day. I didn't hand it to him, Mr. Finch, Arthur replied, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. I tethered him with it. Is standard practice in high-stakes venture capital to build in catastrophic fail-safes. Richard was a high-risk venture. He had a certain ruthless ambition, yes but no pedigree, no loyalty, and a complete absence of a moral compass. I gave him the rope. I simply waited to see if he would use it to build a bridge or hang himself. Finch gripped the edges of his podium, his knuckles white, and the Cayman accounts, the so-called wire transfers. Are you openly admitting in a court of law to illegally hacking and tracking my client's private international banking? There is nothing private about stolen funds, Arthur countered smoothly, adjusting his grip on his silver-tipped cane. Pendleton and Croft manages sovereign wealth funds and aristocratic estates across 3 continents. Mr. Finch, our internal forensic accounting department, cooperates directly with Interpol, MI6, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. When your client attempted to wire $34 million in liquid assets from Dalton Logistics to his little shell company, Blue Horizon, my security algorithms flagged the breach of the foundational covenant. Immediately, Arthur leaned forward, slightly, looking directly into Richard's panicked eyes. In fact, Richard, I believe you tried to check your offshore balance this morning while sitting in the lobby, didn't you? You probably assumed the banking app was experiencing a server error. Richard felt the blood drain entirely from his head, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. He had tried to check the accounts on his encrypted phone just 40 minutes before walking into the courtroom. The screen had simply spun, displaying a sterile connection timed out error. The server wasn't down, Arthur said, a terrifying, predatory smile finally breaking across his weathered face. At exactly 8 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, my solicitors filed a massive injunction in Georgetown. Blue Horizon's assets have been entirely frozen and seized by international authorities pending a federal embezzlement investigation. You don't have $85 million, Richard. As of this morning, your credit cards are declined. Your personal accounts are locked, and you do not possess the cash to buy a cup of coffee on your way out of this building. The courtroom let out a collective gasp. Sarah Jenkins sat, perfectly still, radiating a quiet, profound satisfaction. Clara finally allowed a long, shaky breath to escape. Her lips, the invisible shackles of a decade of emotional abuse shattering, too. Dust on the courtroom floor. Finch slowly backed away from the podium, his aggressive bulldog posture collapsing. Entirely, he looked at Richard, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and professional self-preservation. He was standing next to a talking multi-million-dollar felony, and he knew it. Your Honor, Finch stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic squeak. I believe I need to request a recess to consult with my client. There will be no recess, and there will be no consultation, Mr. Finch. Judge Harrison thundered, his voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room like a physical blow. The judge's face was purple with righteous fury. He stood up slightly, leaning over the heavy mahogany bench, slamming his hand flat against the wood. I have sat in this chair for 22 years. I have presided over thousands of bitter, deceitful divorces, but rarely, if ever, have I seen such a brazen, arrogant, and meticulously calculated display of perjury and fraud committed in my courtroom. Judge Harrison picked up the unredacted trust charter, waving it in the air like a weapon before glaring down at Richard. Mr. Dalton, you sat in that chair. You placed your hand on a Bible, and you swore under penalty of perjury that your financial disclosures were accurate and complete. You cried poverty. You attempted to leave a woman who gave you a decade of her life with absolute pennies while simultaneously attempting to rob her and her family of tens of millions of dollars. You used the sanctity of this court to facilitate a massive financial crime. Tuple. Richard tried to stand his knees, trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the table just to stay upright. Your Honor, please, if you just let me explain. This is a misunderstanding. Sit down and shut your mouth. Judge Harrison roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. The courtroom bailiff immediately stepped forward, unhooking the strap on his utility belt, his hand resting menacingly on his sidearm. Richard swallowed hard and collapsed back into his chair, a broken, hyperventilating shell of the arrogant, untouchable titan who had strutted into the room an hour earlier. Here is my ruling, Judge Harrison continued, sitting back down and grabbing his pen, his voice dropping to a deadly, uncompromising tone. The plaintiff's proposed settlement is entirely thrown out based on the uncontested evidence of the original trust covenant. Dalton, logistics, all of its subsidiaries, physical assets, and intellectual property are hereby recognized as the sole legal property of the Pendleton Trust, of which Clara Hayes is the primary and sole beneficiary. Mr. Dalton, you are stripped of all executive titles, salary, and access to the company immediately. Clara closed her eyes, a single hot tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was the release of a decade of suffocating, soul-crushing pressure. Sarah Jenkins gently reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. Furthermore, the judge added, writing furiously on his official docket, I am granting this divorce with extreme prejudice. Miss Hayes will retain the primary marital estate, the vehicles, and all domestic accounts. Mr. Dalton, I am holding you in contempt of court for egregious perjury. Bail, if you will take Mr. Dalton into custody immediately upon adjournment. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic noise, his hands moving to cover his face. And lastly, Judge Harrison said, looking up with cold finality, I am forwarding the transcripts of this hearing along with Defense exhibit directly to the Cook County State's Attorney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for immediate prosecution regarding wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal perjury. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a loud, definitive crack. "We are adjourned." The courtroom erupted into a flurry of chaotic noise, but to Richard, it was entirely muffled. It was just deafening white noise ringing in his ears. He stared blankly at the scuffed floorboards, his brain completely unable to process the total instantaneous vaporization of his entire existence. He wasn't just broke. He was going to federal prison. He felt a shadow fall over his table. He looked up slowly, his eyes red and wide with terror. Clara was standing directly in front of him. She no longer looked like the faded, submissive woman he had tried to discard. Like garbage, she stood tall, her shoulders back, a terrifying, beautiful strength radiating from her. Arthur stood just a few paces behind her, leaning on his blackthorn cane, watching the scene like a silent, avenging sentinel. Richard opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but no words came out. What would he possibly say? "I'm sorry. It was laughable. You told me I was nothing without you." "Richard," Clara said. Her voice was incredibly steady, completely lacking any of the nervous hesitation that had plagued her for years. "You told me my father was a drunken failure, that he died with nothing in a gutter, and that I would end up exactly like him if I ever dared to leave you." She glanced back at Arthur, sharing a brief, profound look of unbreakable familial love and total vindication before turning her cold, clear eyes back to her ex-husband. "You spent 10 years trying to convince me I was weak, stupid, and helpless," Clara whispered, leaning in just close enough so only he could hear her over the din of the courtroom. "But all you did, Richard, was teach me exactly how to survive a monster. Enjoy the ride to lock up." Clara turned on her heel, the fabric of her simple navy dress swishing elegantly. She walked over to her father and linked her arm firmly through his together. Clara Hayes and Arthur Pendleton walked down the center aisle, their heads held high. The heavy, brass-handled doors swung open to let them out into the stormy Chicago afternoon, leaving Richard Dalton sitting in handcuffs, utterly alone in the absolute ruins of his own greed. Did this courtroom twist leave you completely breathless? Greed always has a heavy price, and Richard Dalton paid his infall. If you loved seeing Clara and her brilliant billionaire father serve ultimate justice to a narcissist, smash that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a good revenge atade. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life drama stories every single